The making of global world. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to state the causes of the Great Depression, describe the Bretton Woods Agreement, give reason why many MNCs relocated production in Asian countries, explain what is referred to as G77 countries. Have you noticed that most of the TVs, mobile phones, and toys we see in the shops seem to be made in Asian countries? Why is it so? Recall the imperial expansion of European nations from the previous lesson, which resulted into the First World War in 1914. The First World War was fought between two power blocs. On the one side were the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, and later joined by the US. And on the opposite side were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. This devastating war lasted for more than 4 years. The death of 9 million working-age men due to World War reduced the able-bodied workforce in Europe. The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic powers, which were now fighting each other to pay for them. Britain borrowed large sums of money from US banks as well as the US public that made the US an international creditor. Britain, which was the world's leading economy in the pre-war period, in particular, faced a prolonged crisis. The war created an atmosphere of economic boom because of rise in demand, production, and employment. Do you think this boom lasted even after the war? No. When the war boom ended after war, there was reduction in production, hence an increase in unemployment. Many agricultural economies were also in crisis. Grain prices fell, rural incomes declined, and farmers fell deeper into debt. In the US, recovery was quicker. The US economy resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. An important feature of the US economy of 1920 was the mass production. It also became a characteristic feature of industrial production in the US. Car manufacturer Henry Ford was a pioneer in the field of mass production. He adopted the assembly line of a Chicago slaughterhouse. The assembly line forced workers to repeat a single task mechanically and continuously, such as fitting a particular part to the car, at a pace dictated by the conveyor belt. This was a way of increasing the output per worker by speeding up the pace of work. At first, workers at the Ford factory were unable to cope with the stress. During such situation, Ford doubled the wages of the company workers. The T-model car was the first car produced under mass production. What advantages do you observe in mass production? Mass production lowered costs of engineering goods. As wages were increased, workers could afford consumer durables like refrigerators all through a system of hire purchase. The demand for refrigerators, washing machines, etc. was also fueled by a boom in house construction and home ownership, financed once again by loans. The housing and consumer boom of the 1920s created the basis of prosperity in the US. In 1923, the US resumed exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. But in the year 1929, the world had to face a great destructive economic crisis due to excessive production. The Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid-1930s. During this period, most parts of the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes, and trade. Though the exact timing and impact of the depression varied across countries, in general, agricultural regions and communities were the worst affected. Can you predict why agricultural regions were worst affected? This was because the fall in agricultural prices was greater and more prolonged than that in the prices of industrial goods. The depression was caused by a combination of several factors. Agricultural overproduction, along with falling prices, resulted into decline in agricultural income. In the mid-1920s, many countries financed their investments through loans from the US. In the first half of 1928, US overseas loans amounted to over $1 billion. But a year later, it was 1/4 of that amount. Countries that depended crucially on US loans now faced an acute crisis. The withdrawal of US loans affected much of the rest of the world. The US was the industrial country most severely affected by the depression. With the fall in prices and the prospect of a depression, US banks had also slashed domestic lending and called back loans. Farmers could not sell their harvests, households were ruined, and businesses collapsed. Unable to recover investments, collect loans, and repay depositors, thousands of banks were bankrupt and were forced to close in the US. Due to an integrated global economy, the tremors of the Great Depression that began in America and spread to Europe were even felt in India, more so in the agricultural sector. It affected Indian trade in agricultural goods. Indian exports and imports were halved. Peasants and farmers were the worst hit. Wheat prices fell in India by 50% and jute by 60% as international prices crashed. In the years of depression, India became the exporter of precious metal gold. The Second World War broke out a mere 2 decades after the end of the First World War. It was fought between the Axis powers, mainly Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy, and the Allies, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union and the US. At least 60 million people, or about 3% of the world's 1939 population, are believed to have been killed directly or indirectly. Now, this was the time when all nations recognized the importance of peace in the world, and hence UNO was set up in 1945. The establishment of UNO helped the liberation of many non-independent nations. Post-war economists and politicians drew 2 key conclusions. An industrial society based on mass production cannot be sustained without mass consumption. Secondly, the goal of full employment could only be achieved if governments had power to control flows of goods, capital, and labor. Thus, the main aim of the post-war international economic system was to preserve economic stability and full employment in the industrial world. Its framework was agreed upon at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, was set up, which were called the twins of Bretton Woods, to meet the needs of the industrial nations. The Bretton Woods Agreement is a framework that has drawn up by the international participation of industrial countries. It was carved out to consolidate the economic recovery in the post-war era. Its main objective was to establish economic stability in the world. The Bretton Woods system inaugurated an era of unprecedented growth of trade and incomes for the Western industrial nations and Japan. At the same time, most developing countries did not benefit from the fast growth of Western economies experienced in the 1950s and 1960s. How do you think these developing nations can experience economic growth? Growth is possible through cooperation. So, the developing nations raised their voice for a new international economic order, NIEO, and organized themselves as Group of 77. By the NIEO, they meant a system that would give them actual control over their natural resources, more development assistance, fair prices for their raw materials. This seemed to be the end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization. Despite years of stable and rapid growth, the industrial world was also getting trapped in unemployment. Till early 1990s, unemployment was dominant and the MNCs began to centralize their productions in those countries of Asia where wages were low. The world's economic geography changed when the MNCs decided to relocate production operation to Asian countries. Have you noticed that most of the TVs, mobile phones, and toys we see in the shops seem to be made in China? The relocation of industry to low-wage countries stimulated world trade and capital flows. In the last 2 decades, the world's economic geography has been transformed as countries such as India, China, and Brazil have undergone rapid economic transformation.